Imagine you are descending a stone staircase that seems to have no bottom. The air around you is getting cooler with every step. Not cold in the way that feels uncomfortable, but cool in the way that a deep cave feels cool, steady, even, ancient. The stone walls on either side of you are smooth in places and rough in others, carved by hands that worked without electric light, without power tools, without any of the things we consider necessary for serious construction. There is a faint smell of earth and mineral, the kind of smell that makes you feel very small and very far from the surface world you came from. Behind you, the opening at the top of the stairs is shrinking. The light from above is becoming a pale gray circle. Ahead of you, deeper, there's only darkness and the soft sound of your own breathing. And somewhere in that darkness, just beyond what your eyes can reach, you begin to sense the presence of something enormous. Not a cavern, not a mine, something built, something intentional, something that could hold thousands of people, that once did hold thousands of people. That was carved out of the living rock not as a curiosity or a hiding place, but as a home. A real, complete, functioning home for an entire civilization that chose, for reasons that history still struggles to fully explain, to go underground. Most people, when they think about underground spaces in human history, picture simple things: root cellars, Roman catacombs, maybe the tunnel systems used during wartime. The general assumption is that living underground was always a last resort, something desperate people did when the surface world became too dangerous, and then abandoned as quickly as possible when the danger passed. That assumption is understandable. It fits with the way we tend to think about progress Euro as a movement upward, outward, into the light. But the deeper you look into the actual history of subterranean human habitation, the more that simple picture begins to complicate itself. Because some of the underground cities that exist in the archaeological record were not built out of desperation. They were not temporary shelters. They were not crude. They were, by any honest measure, remarkable feats of planning and engineering Euro. And the full story of why they were built, and who built them, and what exactly they were preparing for, is still not entirely settled. If you are the kind of person who listens to stories like this one in the quiet hours, when the world outside has gone still and your mind is ready to move slowly through something bigger than the ordinary day, then this channel was made for you. Hidden Pages of History exists for the moments when you want more than the surface version of the past. And if you find yourself wanting to stay in these stories, subscribing takes about 3 seconds and means you will never miss one. To begin to understand the scale of what we are talking about, we need to go to a specific place. A place called Cappadocia in the central region of what is now modern Turkey. If you have never seen photographs of Cappadocia, the landscape alone is arresting. The surface is marked by tall, cone-shaped rock formations called fairy chimneys, Euro, volcanic stone that was soft enough, over thousands of years, to be carved into almost any shape. And the people who lived in this region, long before recorded history as most Americans learn it, understood that softness very well. They carved into it. Not just homes, not just storage rooms, but entire cities. Cities that descended not 10 or 20 feet below the surface, but hundreds of feet. cities with ventilation shafts and water channels and livestock, pens and wine cellars and places of worship and large communal gathering spaces and rolling stone doors that could seal entire sections off from everything above. Cities that, at their peak, could shelter tens of thousands of people for months at a time. The most studied of these is a place called Derinkyu. The name translates simply to deep well, and it is an appropriate name. The structure descends through 18 separate levels, reaching a depth of approximately 250 feet below the surface. It had its own water supply. It had ventilation systems sophisticated enough to keep the air breathable at every level. It had stables on the upper floors so that animals would not contaminate the lower living areas. It had a separate area that researchers believe was used as a religious or educational space, and it had the capacity, according to the best estimates archaeologists have been able to make, to house somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people, along with their food, their animals, and their essential belongings, for periods of extended time. When it was rediscovered in the modern era Y-Euro in 1963, when a homeowner knocked through a wall in his basement and found a passage leading downward Y-Euro, only a fraction of the full complex had been explored. Since then, decades of excavation have revealed more and more of its depth, and there are researchers who believe that what has been found so far is still not all of it. Now, the mainstream explanation for why Derinkyu and the other underground cities of Cappadocia were built is entirely reasonable and deserves to be stated clearly. The region sat at the crossroads of multiple ancient empires and migration routes. The people who lived there faced repeated waves of invasion by Euro-Persians, Arabs, Byzantines, and later Mongol forces all moved through or toward this part of the world at various points across the centuries. The underground cities in this reading were sophisticated defensive structures. When an army approached, the people of the surface would move their families and their animals and their supplies underground, seal the great stone doors from the inside, and wait out the threat. The ventilation systems meant they could survive for months without surfacing. The complexity of the passages meant that even an enemy who found an entrance would face a disorienting maze. This explanation makes sense. It is logical. It accounts for the design features we can observe, and it is almost certainly part of the truth. But here is where things get interesting, because when we look closer at the timeline of these structures and at the full range of underground habitation, sites that exist around the world Y-Euro, not just in Cappadocia but across multiple continents and multiple periods of history Y-Euro, the invasion defense model starts to feel like it might be explaining one layer of a much more complex phenomenon. The carbon dating and ceramic analysis done at various Cappadocian sites suggests that some of these underground spaces were in use far earlier than the historical invasions that are typically used to explain them. Some layers of occupation appear to predate the arrival of the peoples, who are most commonly associated with the structures, which raises a question that the standard explanation does not quite answer. What were those earliest inhabitants afraid of, or preparing for, if not the armies that came later? There's a category of thinking among certain Archaeologists and independent researchers. Why Euro careful? Evidence-driven people, not prone to wild speculation. Why Euro? That suggests the deepest layers of underground habitation in places like Cappadocia may have been built in response to something environmental rather than military. Something happening on the surface that made the surface temporarily uninhabitable. Some researchers point to periods of intense volcanic activity in the region, which would have made the air above ground toxic and the temperature extreme. Others point to the possibility of prolonged climatic disruption. Why Euro? Periods of severe cold or drought or atmospheric change that made the surface world dangerous. Enough that going deep into the earth was the only reliable way to survive. The volcanic tuff that makes up the rock of Cappadocia would have been an ideal insulator against extreme temperature swings. The deep aquifers it sits above would have provided water regardless of what was happening to the rivers and rainfall above. If you were designing a civilization-preserving bunker from scratch, and you happened to be living on top of soft, volcanic rock with a reliable water table beneath you, you could hardly design a better solution than what the builders of Derinkuyu actually built. And Cappadocia is not alone. That is the part of this story that tends to stop people in their tracks when they first encounter it fully. Underground cities and extensive subterranean habitation sites exist on every inhabited continent. In the Gobi Desert, ancient underground networks were used not just for shelter but for irrigation. Why Euro systems called kares or kanat that carried water through underground channels for hundreds of miles, supporting entire agricultural civilizations and landscapes that would otherwise have been completely uninhabitable. In China, the cave dwellings of the Loess Plateau have been continuously occupied for thousands of years, and in some regions still are today. In Malta, a site called the Hypogeum of Halsaflini descends 3 levels below the surface and contains chambers whose acoustic properties Y Euro. The way sound moves and resonates within the carved stone Y Euro were clearly understood and deliberately designed by whoever built it. The structure is at least 5,000 years old. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built cliff dwellings and underground ceremonial spaces, called kivas, that were central to their social and spiritual life. And in multiple locations across the American Midwest and Southeast, there are networks of caves and passages that show evidence of long-term human habitation in ways that mainstream archaeology is still working to fully document and explain. What all of these sites share, across their enormous geographic and cultural diversity, is a quality of intention. These were not accidental shelters. They were not people crawling into whatever hole was available. The people who built these spaces understood geology, hydrology, ventilation, load-bearing stone, and long-term provisioning in ways that we have often underestimated when looking back at pre-modern civilizations. And the question that sits beneath all of that intentionality, why Euro? The question that the invasion defense explanation only partially answers. Why Euro is this? What did these people know about the surface world that made them willing to invest that level of effort and ingenuity in building a life below it? Because here is the thing. about underground survival that most modern people do not fully appreciate until they sit with it. Going underground is not comfortable. It is not pleasant. It is dark and it is confining, and it separates you from the sky and the open air and the natural light that human beings are fundamentally wired to need. People do not choose to live underground for generations, across multiple cultures and multiple continents, simply because it is convenient. They do it because something about the surface has become, or threatens to become, genuinely untenable. And when you map the periods of intense underground habitation against what geologists and climate scientists have reconstructed about the conditions on Earth's surface during those same periods, some very suggestive overlaps begin to appear. Very suggestive overlaps begin to appear. Periods of intensified volcanic activity, periods of rapid climate change, periods that correspond in some of the indigenous oral traditions that have been recorded by anthropologists to stories about the sky changing, about the sun behaving differently, about great upheavals in the natural world that forced people to seek the protection of the earth itself. Now, none of this means that underground cities were built in direct response to catastrophic surface events. The evidence is not clean enough, and the timelines are not precise enough to make that claim with confidence. What it means is that the full picture is more complicated and more interesting than the simple story of people hiding from armies. It means that our ancestors had a relationship with the underground that was practical and sophisticated and, in some cases, deeply cultural. Euro. That for certain civilizations, at certain moments in history, the earth beneath their feet was not a last resort but a first principle, a place of safety and continuity, a place where what mattered most about their civilization could be preserved and kept alive, while whatever was happening on the surface ran its course. There's also something worth considering about what these underground spaces tell us about the people who built them in terms of their vision of time. Building a structure like Derinkuyu Euro, carving 18 levels into solid rock, engineering a ventilation system that still functions today, designing rolling stone doors that a single person could move from the inside. Euro, that is not a project of weeks or even years. It is a project of generations. It means that the people who started it understood that they were building something for their descendants, not for themselves, that they held a view of the future that was long enough and serious, enough to justify that kind of investment. There is a kind of wisdom in that view that feels, in some ways, quietly challenging when you hold it up against the way most modern institutions think about time and planning and the future. We build things meant to last decades. They build things meant to outlast civilizations. The underground cities of the world are still being studied. New sections of Derinkuyu are still being mapped. New subterranean sites are still being discovered, sometimes by accident, sometimes through deliberate survey work, sometimes because a homeowner breaks through a wall and finds something that shouldn't be there. In 2014, construction workers in Nevquer, a city built directly above the old Cappadocian underground networks, discovered a previously unknown underground complex that initial estimates suggested might be even larger than Derinkuyu. The excavation of that site is ongoing. What it will eventually reveal, how deep it goes, how old it truly is, and exactly why it was built, why Euro. Those answers are still being searched for. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about all of this is that underground survival was never a single thing. It was never just military strategy or just climate refuge or just cultural tradition. It was all of those things at different times and in different places, layered on top of each other in ways that are genuinely difficult to separate cleanly at this distance in time. The people who built these spaces were responding to real pressures and real dangers, and they were doing so with intelligence and foresight, and a depth of practical knowledge that deserves more credit than it typically receives in the abbreviated versions of history that most of us grow up with. Maybe the real story of Subterranean civilization is a story about human adaptability at its most determined, about the willingness to fundamentally reimagine what home means when the surface world stops being safe, about the capacity to look at a problem that seems completely overwhelming. Why Euro? How do you keep a civilization alive when the world above you is burning or freezing or being overrun? Why Euro? And answer it not with despair, but with stone tools and careful planning and a vision long enough to build across generations. We may never fully know what it felt like to descend those stairs for the first time, to carry your children and your animals and your most essential things down into the earth and hear the great stone door roll shut behind you, sealing out whatever was waiting above. But we can stand at the entrance of those ancient passages today, as thousands of visitors do every year, and feel the cool air rising from below, and let that feeling ask us something about what our own civilization would do, what we ourselves would do, if the surface world we depend on stopped being reliable, whether we have somewhere in us the same quality of foresight and determination and willingness to adapt that built those 18 levels of carved stone in the dark. Those questions do not require dramatic answers. They just require the willingness to sit with them honestly, which is exactly what this channel is here for. If this story made you think about something differently, or opened a question you want to keep exploring, we would genuinely love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us why Euro. If you had to go underground tomorrow, what would you bring? What would matter most? Every comment gets read here. And if someone in your life is the kind of person who lies awake wondering about the deeper layers of history, share this with them tonight. Some conversations are best started in the quiet hours. Hidden pages of history will keep going down, and there is a great deal more to find.